Welcome to FusionReactor.
Hi, my name is Michael Flewitt. I am the technical support engineer for FusionReactor. I'm joined today by Charlie Earhart, an independent server troubleshooting consultant who's worked with FR since it came out and helps us evangelize the product. So this is the first installment of what I hope to become a monthly event where you can see new products or features we're working on, interesting developments in technologies, and you'll have the opportunity to ask us any questions you may have. So if you have any questions or comments as we go through the session, drop them in the chat and we'll address them. We're going to primarily focus on the questions related to FusionReactor 8.3, but we'll also answer any other questions you may have. Okay, so today we're going to look at what's new in 8.3. So 8.3 did release last week, and if you have a chance to upgrade, you should consider doing so now. So there are a few key improvements in 8.3, these being CPU alerting in crash protection, event snapshot improvements, so support for cold fusion, and we've enabled the feature by default. Brand new documentation with the ability for any user to edit, and themes and improvements to the FusionReactor Cloud UI. So the first feature we're going to cover has been heavily requested, and this is the ability to configure CPU alerting for crash protection. So this alert is based on the instance CPU rather than the server CPU. This is basically for if you have a request using a large amount of CPU, if you had any background process using vast amounts of resource, or if you had a memory tuning issue, so garbage collection is using too much CPU, anything like that, you can now configure alerts for this. So the CPU protection works in a very similar way to the memory protection. You configure your threshold, you configure the minimum duration, and then you set your alerting strategy. So you have a few options. So you can generate an email, you can queue requests in FusionReactor until the usage is under the threshold, or you can reject requests in FusionReactor until the CPU is under the threshold. And you can use a combination of email and reject and email and queue as well. So as a quick example, I'm going to set my CPU usage to 50% for a duration of 10 seconds. And I'm going to set to email notification only. So if I save this setting, and then I'm just going to run a request that runs Fibonacci on a number of threads. So this will give us the CPU usage. So your email settings will be under FusionReactor and then settings. And then it's the first tab that loads. So you'll have your email address, your username, your password. And then the other thing to watch out for is in the settings, under email settings, there is a flag to enable these notification emails. So if both of those configured, your emails will come through your inbox. So in the web metrics, what we can is if we look at, say, the last minute, we've had constant CPU of just above 50%. And if I look in my inbox, I can see that I do have my crash protection email. Okay, so if I look at my alert, I can see in the information section, the threshold and the actual values and the trigger time. Under the load, I can see the number of requests running, the CPU usage at the time, so it's 56%, which is above that 50% threshold, and then the memory usage. One thing to note is that even though the Fibonacci request was using the CPU, it's not always going to be the triggering request. Because the alert is based on the CPU usage at the time, we can't route the triggering request always back to the CPU instance, or the instance CPU, sorry. So that means in our case, execute query was the triggering request, and Fibonacci, which is actually in the running requests, was the one that caused the issue. So you can't see the exact request, but you can see all that was running at the time the alert fired. And this is the same with the memory protection as well as the web request quantity protection. Okay. So that was the CPU alerting and crash protection. As Charlie said, if you're familiar with the CPU, the memory protection, it's a very similar concept. And if you're not, it should only take a couple of minutes to configure. And if you are running into these issues, it can save you a lot of time, because if you do have these times when you get slow servers or anything, you have that information to hand, and you can just go through that rather than having to dig through your log files. So we've also made some changes to event snapshots. So event snapshots may not be a feature you're entirely familiar with. They were added in FusionReactor 8.0 or 8.0. However, due to a limitation in the way that Cold Fusion handled exceptions, we did not turn this feature on by default. It could have had a large performance impact on the server, so we had to at the time disable the feature, and you could opt into it. Now it's been reversed. So for Cold Fusion, you have the Cold Fusion event snapshots, and for most other servers, you have the traditional event snapshot. But both of these are enabled by default, and you get them however you run FusionReactor. This effectively means if you're running 8.3 and you have any recurring errors, the stack frames, logging information, and variables for the error will be captured automatically. So you can find and fix issues without always needing a debugger. So you could see everything you needed to without necessarily having to have that information. So what I'm going to do is if I go to my request history, you'll see I have a mix of erroring and non-erroring requests, all going to either arg.cfm or arg.cfc. So if I look at my arg.cfm, I see I have an event snapshot. If I click on the event snapshot, the first thing we see is a method selection exception. So this is the exception that occurred. So the method or the function length was not available on the object it was called. And if we look in the code, we can see the green line highlights that we were calling this on the variable arg. In variables, I can look at the variable scope, and we can see that arg was equal to 0, which was an integer. So you can't call the length method on an integer. That's not a supported method, hence the exception. So in the variables section, we only see the variables captured on the triggering of the CFM. So this would mean if you look at us as our stack frames, only the top frame has any of these variables. If I go down to the second frame, you'll see I don't have any variables selected. So I see there is no content. If I go back up to the top frame, I see my variables. If I look, for example, at a CFC request, so if I go back to my error history, and then I look at a CFC example, what we will see is that despite the fact we're running similar code, so we have process arg, we have arg.length, this time on line 21 of the errors.cfc, in variables, we do not see foo, which we created at line 18. This is a limitation of Cold Fusion and how we've implemented it. You can override this, however. So if we went to the debugger and then settings, and you go to event snapshot, you'll see the message saying exception support is currently disabled. You'll need to enable this in order to have the full variables, including in the CFCs. So to do this, you would set the system property here. It can have performance impact on Cold Fusion servers. So if you are going to try it, maybe try it on staging first to make sure it's okay. It's not guaranteed you will, but it's always better to check. This is unfortunately a limitation we cannot work around. It's just something we have to cope with. While we're on the topic of event snapshots, I just want to briefly cover the storage of a snapshot. So a snapshot is covering or will cover any unique stack trace. So if you had the same exception twice, you would get a snapshot. If that exception fired another time, it would use the same snapshot as before. It would not generate a new one. So the idea behind this is to save space. So we can store 1,000 snapshots, and these are on disk, or we can store a certain disk size in kilobytes. And this gives you the ability to control how much we store. If you're on a smaller disk, you can tune this as you would need to. So I'm just looking in the chat. So we've had a few questions. Will this debugger view work with Java application 2 or only CF? It does work with Java. So if I go back to, say, my Tomcat server, Right now, I don't have any. So I do have some errors, and you'll see I do have an event snapshot for these errors. So I would see this would have to decompile the Java code. So it can be in certain examples. For example, this JSP. I'm looking at the JSP code I was running. I have the frames. I have my variables. I have the code, and I have the exception. So it works in a very similar way. Okay.
And the rest just already answer those.
Okay. So these were the two main FusionReactor features. So this was the CPU alerting and for crash protection and the event snapshot. So the event snapshot wasn't new, but a lot of people weren't aware of it. Now you should see it more often because it's turned on by default. And if you look on your error history, you may see you now have these snapshots that you didn't before. So the next improvement we're going to look at is actually outside the product itself. So this is actually the FusionReactor documentation. So the FusionReactor documentation for the last few years has been running on our Confluent server. We know it has some issues. Confluent search isn't fantastic. Because there are so many versions, it's hard to find the exact version you want to be running. And then there's a few other problems we have in there. For example, a lot of pages can be slow, and if there are any broken links, it's very hard to find out. So what we've done for 8.3 is we've introduced a brand new docs server. So right now, this is available at docs2.fusion-reactor.com. This is not currently released, so it's a brand new thing, and we will be bringing it up soon. Currently, it is not feature complete, and it's not been through a full QA cycle. So there will be things that need changing. There will be things that aren't quite there yet, but very soon we hope to get this out there. So there are a few major benefits of this. So we will now only be maintaining one version of the docs. So you won't be able to, or you won't be keep finding these older versions of the docs. If you want the older versions, they are available as PDFs. But for the most part, you shouldn't need these. What we're also going to be doing is we're going to have much better search. So if I search for CPU, I have all the hits for CPU, including anything in subheadings or content. So you can find what you're after a lot quicker than you could before. And you can do this for any phrase. So if you wanted to search for email, you would see the references to email, and you can get a nice search result where you can hopefully find what you're looking for. If you can't find what you're looking for, or you find something and it's not ideal, what you can actually do is you can suggest improvements. So right now, these docs are not public on GitLab, they are private, but when we officially release them, they will be public. So you can submit merge requests, and this is just a markdown doc. So you can submit merge requests to the markdown for any changes. If these changes are approved, they will be rolled into the documentation. So this gives you the power to make any changes you feel would be appropriate and help others too.
On the
Yes,
left.
so we have made these significant improvements to the docs. What we've done is we have rewritten most of the installation guide to be more concise. It's a lot more longer, more informative pages than all the short ones. For example, one page we were missing for a while was just what's the difference between the automatic and the manual installation method. So now you have a clear definition of both. So for example, if you're using the automated installer, you cannot do this on remote machines. You have to do this on each machine. And scripting the installation process was not as simple. So in these cases, using the manual is actually a lot better for you. And it's just having this information available now. Okay, so what we will do is for a while, we'll actually run these docs in parallel. So you'll have docs2.fusion-reactor.com and you'll have docs.fusion-reactor.com. And these both, so the docs is currently the Confluence documentation as you know it. In time, we will effectively phase out the old docs and you will only have these docs available to you. So one final major improvement is actually to the FusionReactor Cloud. Okay, so there are, I imagine, a few of you that aren't aware of the cloud. So the cloud is actually an extension to the on-premise version of FusionReactor. So the idea of cloud is that the data in your local FusionReactor will be shipped to the cloud periodically. So in the cloud, your data, your metrics, they will be aggregated. And then you will have 90 days or up to 90 days of historical data analysis. So you, as well as having real time, you can have historical error analysis, and you can do both to whichever you, well, to whatever you require. And there are a few major features. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just as a high level. So you have application level metrics. This is something you can get in a FusionReactor, but only for the local instance. If I have several applications running the same application, so they're behind a load balancer, they're in Dockerized containers, anything like that, all this information will be available under one place. So under applications, I've got all my applications. I can click into the application, and then I see all the requests for however many copies there are. You have the ability to create custom graphs, custom metrics, and custom dashboards. So if you are running, let's say, a server and you're using, say, Frappies for custom metrics, or if you had a dashboard that would be really useful to you, but you don't have by default, you can make these graphs. You can make these metrics, you can apply them to each server, and you can make cloud customizable. On top of this, we have highly customizable alerting. So this, in FusionReactor, you've seen crash protection today, but what you also have in cloud is this big alerting engine. And you can alert on any metric on an instance, group, or server level. So for example, if I go to checks, you see I have 3 currently configured. But if I create a new check, okay, so I'll simply name it test for this purpose, and I can create an application level check for the application of my key, which is my Cold Fusion application, and I can filter by metric. So in my case, what I want to do is error. So in these filters, I can simply search for error. Okay. And I can set an error threshold. So let's say I have 100 errors. Or I can set a warning. So let's say 75 errors. And then you trigger at given data points. So if I said a single data point within a 5-minute period where there are more than 75 errors a minute or 100 errors a minute, I would like a warning or an error. And in terms of alerting platforms, you have more than just email. So in FusionReactor, you can send email notifications. In my case here, I have email, I have a webhook, which is just called test, and I have Slack. So I can send to Slack, I can save this check, and now we'll be alerted under this any point in this error threshold. And this was a simple case, but I can alert on any metric, for example, status code of requests, memory or memory space usage, garbage collection, thread count, anything to do with flavors of transaction, so JDBC errors, the number of running HTTP requests. If we track it, you can alert on it. So you can make alerts very customizable to your use case. So people that have used cloud before may have already noticed that what I'm actually running in the cloud browser right now is a light theme, and that's not been available before. So if I'm in the cloud, I can use the hotkey Q, or I can go to my account settings and I can change the theme of cloud. So themes are obviously a topic of debate. I switch between the two, but I primarily prefer dark themes. I know a lot of you prefer light themes. It all depends on your preference, but now you can choose. One other change is actually to warning messages. So before in the cloud, if you were looking at a time period and let's say there was no data available, it wasn't always particularly clear. Now what we have is we have the ability to see this information. So let's say if I go to my Tomcat instance, and then if I look at transactions, and then rather than looking at the live view, if we look at historic data, so if I go to say errors, okay, so now we have errors for this time frame. If I change my time frame to, let's say 9 o'clock this morning when the server wasn't running, when this data refreshes, that was the last of the major changes. Yep, and as Nick mentioned in the chat, even if you are already using FusionReactor, say on the on-premise edition, you've got an Ultimate or a developer license, you can get a free cloud trial, and that will last 2 weeks, and you can have as many servers as you need on this to try it out. So you're not limited to, if I already have FusionReactor, I can't get a trial for the cloud. Feel free to just go to app.fusionreactor.io, and you can register for a trial there. So we're next just going to cover some smaller improvements, things you should just be generally aware of. They're not huge, but again, they make subtle differences. So if I go to, say, middle click, and FusionReactor is one of them. So if I go to my web request history, I can now use middle click or control click or command click if you're on Mac, anything like that, and I can open things in new windows. This wasn't previously possible. The benefit of this is, let's say, for example, I go to my error history and I want to compare 4 errors. I can simply middle click on all the errors, open them in new tabs, and I can see all the data individually. I don't have to duplicate the tab many, many times. So the next one is support for Command Box 4.9. Command Box 4.9 is currently in alpha, so it's not officially released, but we do now support this. So if you're running, let's say, applications on the cutting edge alpha, or when the official version releases, you can monitor this with FusionReactor with no problems. So next is a bug fix, but we've fixed some call box tracking. So there were a few corners or specific things in Cold Fusion, in any call box that we didn't track. That's been resolved. We support ARM64 and Arch64 architectures. So this is something previously before you had to remove the debug library to use. We support Wildfly 14 to 19. So we recently saw Wildfly 14 to 19 were growing in popularity, and we now support these servers. So what we can now do is, if you're running a cutting edge Wildfly application, you're using Spring or whatever you want to do with Wildfly, we can now track that for you. We track RMI calls. This is only for Java 17 to 19. But if you've got, say, a front and a back end communicating with RMI, you will see the calls to and from the RMI servers. And then the final one is Kubernetes detection. So if you are on cloud, there is a special billing rate for Docker. I'm not going to go too much into detail about this, but what we can do is just address this either in a later question, or you can go to the pricing page. Basically, Docker containers or Kubernetes containers are billed at a quarter of the rate of a standard server. So a general question about FR in general: can it integrate into a microservice architecture with Kubernetes? Running with Lucy 5 as containers in the cluster. So yes, it can. FusionReactor can run in Kubernetes, and we do actually run it in our own microservices. So it won't run on serverless, but it will run on microservices. So if you're running Kubernetes and you're spinning up either Docker instances or pods, however you're doing it, as long as you have the Java agent in place, which you would typically do through the manual installation, you can have your Kubernetes monitored. And we do actually have a specific Docker example in the docs. And this covers things such as, so an installation example of how to add the Java agent, how to get the files, adding configuration into Docker, and system properties to add for the licensing and things like this. So just to wrap up what we're actually going to do, just go back to the slides. One thing to note about Java 1.6, you'll have seen a few blog posts about this. We have dropped support for Java 1.6. The reason we had to do this is to support newer Java versions and frameworks. It just had to unfortunately be done at this point in time. If you are running an older Cold Fusion server, such as version 8 or version 9, you can actually monitor these servers, but you do have to upgrade the JRE. And you just do this in the either JVM config file, or correct me if I'm wrong, Charlie, but you can do that in the CF admin.
Either one. Yep, either one.
Yep, so you could do that in both. And if you do require 1.6, you can still run FusionReactor 8.2 with no problems. You just can't move any higher. We're now just going to cover any questions you may have.
So let's
Okay.
go back to that first one that Ram Gopal asked, and it's a good opportunity to point out, for everybody's sake, there's other questions coming up that are also not about what's new. So Mike has pointed out how there's the documentation. Some people don't want to read docs, but the good news is that the docs are getting better. So you'll want to, in the future for sure, look at the new docs. And the existing docs that are there do also have lots of great information. It's just sometimes a little bit spread around. But I want to also point out for folks that are not, even if you're not new to FusionReactor, you may be seeing some things today that you've not seen before, like the alerting, maybe you never used it, or the snapshot, maybe you never used it, or the cloud, maybe you never used it. So another thing to point out is that if you just Google FusionReactor webinars, there's about 24 webinars that we've done over the past 3-4 years, and none of them have been repeats. They're all on different topics that would each address things like we've talked about in more detail. So you'll want to definitely look for that. And then there is also on the FusionReactor, in fact, Mikey, why don't you go ahead and show the FusionReactor website? Because some people just use it and never look at the website because somebody else installs it for them. And you should just know that there is ample resources here on this website. And in a moment, you'll see up at the top, there's a support. And in that support, there's a drop down for many things, including the docs and videos and other means of support. So you can definitely get questions answered in many, many different ways. And then today's use of YouTube Live is another way to give people a chance to ask questions that perhaps they hadn't known about the other approaches.
And obviously in the future, we will hopefully be hosting more of these. So if you had any ideas for topics or anything like that, we'd be happy to cover these in future sessions if you wanted anything more in depth.
And Ramgo, your second or last question, you ask about a Docker container. No, there's not a Docker container. The point is you can implement FusionReactor into a container where you've implemented whatever, Cold Fusion, Lucy, Java, and it's just, you just implement FusionReactor. The fact that that FusionReactor or that thing you're monitoring is running in Docker, running in Kubernetes, it's really transparent. On the surface, it's transparent to FusionReactor. It's going to work the same way. Now, where it gets interesting is if you start to spin up multiple instances, obviously you don't want to necessarily be having to open up and looking at a single, tabs in browsers, trying to keep up with these instances. And that's where the cloud edition becomes really valuable, because the cloud edition automatically detects such instances as you spin them up if you have the cloud version. And again, we're not really today talking about any of these particular features at length. And Mikey, didn't we talk about a future one we're thinking of doing will be on the cloud in general? Because it is.
So we have I personally have a few ideas for future ones. One of them would be just basically a quick or a higher level introduction to all the cloud features. So again, say 20, 30 minutes, just going through the features and what they do. Another one would actually be just a tutorial about getting FusionReactor running in command box and all the various configurations and settings you may have. We could go through things like profilers, understanding them a bit better. There's all sorts of things we could go through, depending on kind of what we could be missing out there, what people will be interested in using. But there's endless possibilities, really.
And again, we've done many of the topics in the webinars in the past, but some of them have been 2 or 3 years ago.
What I would also like to do is just loop back. We had a question earlier. So it is a general question, but the question was, can you please touch upon how to read the FusionReactor stats and graphs? So the main things to concentrate on. So this is a very subjective topic. Depending on what you're looking for and what issues you have, you would go to kind of various places within the product, be that on the cloud or the local Fusion Reactor. One of your kind of staple pages is the web metrics. This is just under metrics and then web metrics at the top. And this is your overview of Fusion Reactor. So you can see kind of your activity and your average time. So you can see your throughput and how long things are taking. You can see your database activity, your memory, and your CPU. You've also got stats for the last 60 seconds. You've got error counts, number of slow requests, the average request duration, things like this, just so you can quickly monitor and see the health of the application. You've got memory stats, and you've got, so there's lots of things on this page. You've got status code counts, and depending on the load of your server, you're going to see different data here. If you're looking maybe towards JVM tuning, what you may want to pay attention to is resources. So there you can see information on the memory heap, memory spaces, buffer pools, garbage collection, things like this. You can see JIT time or class loading, so the number of classes loaded and how long they're taking. You can see information on the threads. So if you went to, say, the thread visualizer, you can see the state threads are in and how they transition between these states, find any block threads, anything like that. If we're looking at a SERL level, you can maybe look at the system resources. So you've got system metrics where you can see the instance CPU, network usage, disk read and write, the overall RAM of the machine. So for me personally, it's hard to answer that question. There's no right answer to which graph you need to look at. It very much depends on how you wish to use the product and what you're looking for. You got any thoughts on that, Charlie?
Well, Mikey, that was why I pointed out the webinars. I was specifically trying to deflect getting too far into all the possible things we could cover. So let's, let's take a moment. Go ahead and, if you could, open a tab in your browser and just show people. If you just literally Google FusionReactor webinars.
I think I've got them.
Okay, well there you go. You've already so there's everybody at FusionReactor.com/webinars. And if you just look from the top, they're in reverse descending, chronological order. So the most recent are at the top. Well, if you notice, that first one is troubleshooting with Fusion Reactor Part 4, and then there's a Part 3, a Part 2, and a Part 1. I did those in an attempt to help people who were new to Fusion Reactor or who had used it for years but just were like lost in the sea of all the information. Those 4 parts are meant to say, let's assume you don't know what's a possible way to solve problems. I talk about what's just happened on my server. So that's things like he talked about, the web metrics, request history, the error history, CPU, memory, garbage collection. And go ahead and scroll up, Mikey.
Sure.
And then the Part 2 is on why are requests running slow? Why are transactions, queries running slow? And then I broke down discussing things that are specific to that: request details, JDBC details, relations, history. And then go ahead and up to the Part 3. And then that was when requests are slow for a less obvious reason. So sometimes you'll find the answers quickly. Sometimes you'll be left going, I still don't get it. So this Part 3 was to say, well, let's learn how to take advantage of things like stack tracing, profiling, the sampler, and the memory profiler. And then finally, the Part 4 was for post-crash troubleshooting. Go ahead and scroll up, Mikey, please. So sometimes you would come upon a problem and maybe CoFusion or Lucy or Java has restarted. Maybe it was yesterday, or maybe it was an hour ago. But you'll find that the Fusion Reactor interface doesn't show what went on, obviously, in the previous iteration of the instance. Well, there are ways, and I talked here about archive metrics, which is new in 7.2. Some people have not even seen that, and the alerts and the logs, and then the FR Cloud and its alerts and profiling capabilities. So the point is, these are just 4 of the 24 some different webinars that there have been, but those would be a good 4 ones for folks to start with. And for sure, we will find opportunities to elaborate on some of these points down the road.
Okay, and then one question I noticed, we are currently running a standalone Tomcat and starting to test a Tomcat cluster. Is there any documentation for integration into the cluster? So I'm not entirely sure what cluster you'll be running, whether it be Kubernetes, Docker Swarm, hypervisor, anything like that. But basically, if you were running, let's say the same server setup and you wanted to clone them, what you could do is you could just use manual installation, and you could just basically script the installation, whether that's through Bash or batch scripts, or through Docker files, however you want to do it. And all you would need to do is basically you would configure your Tomcat. So you would download the installation files, you would create the directory structures, and then you would place the files in the structure. You add your JVM arguments, which are your JVM and, sorry, your Java agent and your agent paths. And when this is done, FusionReactor is installed. And what you can do is, I think under configuration we added this, you can copy configuration between instances. So the settings of FusionReactor are stored in a single configuration file. And what you can do is you can configure one instance to be exactly how you like it, and you simply take this file and you put it into all your images or containers, whatever you're doing. So the configuration, when you've done it once, you can just script to do it again and again the exact same way. So there's no specific example for, say, a Tomcat cluster, but the installation would be the same no matter what you're running.
And so, folks, we're really here to answer any other questions you have. Feel free. Now's a great time. And by the way, Mikey, while we're waiting, I'll just say that it wouldn't be a bad idea to do one of these on installing FusionReactor.
Sure.
And showing the two general ways.
Yeah, we can do that. So, I mean, I think what we could do for that, which may help, is if we did, say, a Docker installation, maybe a manual, maybe an automatic, and just, if you wanted anything to discuss further, you can contact us with suggestions of ideas or anything like that. If it's anything to do with the webinars or anything like this, you can actually contact me at mikey@fusion-reactor.com, and that'll come straight to me. That could be questions about installation, questions about features, topics you might want covering, anything like that. And if it's an interesting question, we can easily convert it to a later webinar. If you wanted any support on the product, you can contact the support team at support@fusion-reactor.com. And if you wanted any troubleshooting or advice from Charlie, you can contact him at support@careheart.org. So with those three channels, you can reach out, and hopefully we can help you, whether it be on a webinar or offline.